This LOS is calculate and interpret 1, the joint probability of two events, 2, the probability that at least one of the two events will occur given the probability of each and the joint probability of the two events, and 3, a joint probability of any number of independent events. Okay, success on these type of questions is that these questions become a classic CFA case of given 3 variables, solve for the 4th. So number 1, read the question. 2, write out the formula, make x the unknown, and then solve. So the key is to know the formula. P, the probability of A or B, and the way that reads is the probability that A and or B occurs. So the example is if 95% of the stocks have paid a dividend and or announced a stock split. So when you see the and or, if they're giving you that as a given, that's the number is going to slot in there. If that's what they're asking for, that becomes the x. Probability of A and probability of B should be easy to identify in any question. And then finally, the last variable here, the probability of AB, that's the joint probability of A and B both occurring. So the example is the joint probability of a stock paying dividend and announcing a stock split. So when you see the word joint probability, if it's given to you, the number is going to fill in there. If they're asking you to solve for it, that becomes the x. So again, read the question, write out the formula, fill in what's given to you, solve for x. These become fairly easy. So let's look at a practice problem now. The probability of event A is 40%. The probability of event B is 60%. The joint probability of AB is 40%. The probability that A or B occurs or both occurs is closest to A, 40%, B, 60%, or C, 84%. So the correct answer is B, 60%. So as I said, if you follow the steps, the key is to know the formula. P, probability of A or B equals the probability of A plus the probability of B minus the joint probability. So in this one, it's asking you for the probability that A or B occurs. So I put that in green there. That's what the x. We're solving for x in this case. They give us the probability of A, they give us the probability of B, and they give us the joint probability of AB. So it's simply 40 plus 60 minus 40 equals 60%. So that's really easy. We're using the addition rule for probability of A or B occurring. Quite easy. That should be under 90 seconds if you're well practiced. Let's do another practice problem. The manager of a pension fund determines that during the past 5 years, 85% of the stocks in the portfolio have paid a dividend and 40% of the stocks have announced a stock split. If 95% of the stocks have paid a dividend and or announced a stock split, the joint probability of a stock paying a dividend and announcing a stock split is closest to A, 30%, B, 45%, or C, 55%. I think you'll find now that by following the steps, these questions are becoming a lot easier. So once again, the key is to know the formula. The probability of A or B, so that's the probability that A and or B occurs, equals the probability of A plus the probability of B minus the joint probability of A and B both occurring. So in this case, you read the question carefully. Always go to that last sentence and see what they're asking for. They're asking for the joint probability, so I highlighted that in bold green for you here. So you can see, write out the formula, and then you know that you're solving for the x, you're solving for the joint probability, and go back and find the other variables in the question. So we're looking for the words, remember we're looking for the words and or for that first term, and we can see it there, 95% of the stocks have paid a dividend and or announced a stock split. So we've got that, the probability of A or B, 95%. Probability of A, 85%. Probability of B, 45%. So we just write out the formula, we solve for x, 95% equals 85% plus 40% minus the joint probability. So we can just move this over with the algebra. The joint probability is going to be 85% plus 40% minus 95%. So we're going to get 30%. So the correct answer is A. I think that you see that if you just follow these steps again and again, I told you this becomes a classic example of 4 variables given 3, solve for the 4th. It's just familiarizing yourself with the language. Joint probability is the last term. When you see and or, that's the first term. And probability of A and probability of B are usually pretty easy to identify. Okay, we're down to the last practice question for this LOS. So a fundamental analyst studying 100 potential companies for inclusion in her stock portfolio uses the following screening criteria. So the first screening criteria is a market to book ratio over 4. 20 companies out of the 100 meet that criteria. The second screening criterion is the current ratio over 2. 40 companies out of the 100 potential companies meet that screen. And return on equity over 10% is the last screening criterion, and 25 companies out of the 100 meet that screen. So assuming that the screening criteria are independent, the probability in percentage terms that a given company will meet all 3 screening criteria is closest to A, 2%, B, 8.5%, or C, 20%. Okay, this question is quite easy. Just the one thing that you had to realize is that they're giving you a pool of 100 companies, and so 20 companies are meeting this screen, so that's just 20 divided by 100, that's a 20%, okay? So they made that really easy, but just look out if they use some different numbers and total numbers. You just have to, because you need this in terms of a percentage. And the way that we get the joint probability of meeting 3 independent criteria is we're just going to multiply them all. So it's 0.2 times 0.4 times 0.25, and that's going to give us 0.02 or 2%, and that is definitely under 90 seconds if you're up to speed on this type of question. So that's the last slide for this LOS. Thank you very much.